Sometimes a single sentence can quietly break the life a person thought was steady. And for Emily Carter, that sentence came on an ordinary rainy Thursday night in Seattle. The house smelled of tomato soup and fresh bread, the kind of simple dinner she and her husband Daniel had shared for years. And nothing felt unusual until she noticed how silent he was, how his eyes stayed on the table instead of meeting hers. Emily had always believed that problems announced themselves loudly, with sharp words or slammed doors. But Daniel's distance had arrived softly over months. Late nights at work, distracted replies, tired smiles that did not reach his eyes. She had told herself it was stress, that every marriage had seasons, that love sometimes moved quietly beneath the surface. But that night, as rain tapped against the windows and the clock ticked too loudly in the background, she felt something shifting. Daniel folded his hands together as if holding on to courage. "I think we need space," he said, his voice calm but heavy. Emily did not understand at first. The words sounded gentle, almost reasonable, yet they landed like a crack through glass. "Space?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He nodded, finally looking at her with tired honesty. He explained that he felt lost, that somewhere between work deadlines, mortgage payments, and daily routines, he no longer recognized himself. He said he still cared for her deeply, but he needed time to figure out who he was outside of being a husband, an employee, a provider. There was no anger in his tone, no blame placed on her shoulders, and somehow that made it harder. If he had shouted, she could have defended herself. If he had accused her, she could have argued. But he simply looked sad. Emily's mind raced through memories. Their wedding day under soft summer light, their first small apartment with secondhand furniture, the nights they stayed up dreaming about travel and children and future plans. None of it felt false. Yet now she saw how their conversations had grown shorter, how they spoke more about schedules than feelings, how laughter had become rare. "Do you want me to leave?" she asked quietly, because she needed the words to be clear. Daniel hesitated only a second before answering, "For a while. I think it might help us breathe." He used the word us, and Emily held on to it like a fragile thread. She wondered if he truly meant them as a couple or just the idea of what they once were. The room felt smaller, as if the walls had moved closer. Emily felt a strange mix of hurt and understanding. She had sensed his distance, had even felt her own heart growing tired of trying to fix something she could not name. Still, she had believed time would solve it. She never imagined time would mean separation. Daniel spoke about temporary space, about not wanting a divorce, about believing that distance might remind them why they chose each other in the first place. His words were careful, almost rehearsed, and Emily realized he had been thinking about this for weeks. That knowledge hurt more than the request itself. While she had been planning grocery lists and weekend errands, he had been planning space. A quiet fear rose inside her, not just of losing him, but of facing herself alone. For 10 years, she had built her identity around their shared life. She adjusted her work hours to match his schedule, moved to neighborhoods closer to his office, supported his career changes without question. She had done these things out of love, not duty, but now she wondered when she had last asked herself what she wanted. Daniel reached across the table and touched her hand, and the familiar warmth made her chest ache. "I don't want to hurt you," he said. "I just don't want us to wake up one day full of regret." Emily swallowed back tears. She wanted to fight for them, to suggest counseling, to promise she could be more supportive, more exciting, more whatever he felt was missing. But deep down, she knew love could not grow in a space where one person felt trapped. The rain outside grew heavier, filling the silence between them. After a long pause, she nodded slowly. "If this is what you need," she said, surprising herself with her calmness, "then I'll give you space." Saying it felt like stepping off solid ground. Daniel's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if he had been bracing for resistance. They discussed practical details with strange politeness: how long she might stay away, what to tell friends, how to handle bills. It felt less like a fight and more like signing papers for a temporary truce. Later that night, Emily stood in their bedroom staring at the closet they shared. The room held years of shared mornings and whispered goodnights, yet it suddenly felt unfamiliar. She pulled out a suitcase and began placing clothes inside, each folded shirt feeling heavier than it should. Daniel stood by the doorway, offering to help, but she gently shook her head. Packing alone felt necessary. As she zipped the suitcase, she glanced at the framed wedding photo on the dresser. They looked so young, so certain. She did not feel anger toward him. She felt grief for the simplicity they once had. Before bed, they sat together on the edge of the mattress, not touching, both aware that this was a turning point. "This doesn't mean the end," Daniel said softly. Emily wanted to believe him, and part of her did. But another part sensed that space changes people. It forces them to grow in directions they cannot predict. That night, she lay awake listening to the rain and to Daniel's steady breathing beside her, wondering if she would ever hear it the same way again. By morning, the sky had cleared, leaving the world washed and quiet. Daniel carried her suitcase to the car, and they stood in the driveway longer than necessary. There were no dramatic goodbyes, only a long embrace filled with unspoken fears. As Emily drove away, she looked at the house in the rearview mirror until it disappeared from sight. She did not know where this path would lead, whether it would bring her back to him or somewhere entirely new. All she knew was that her husband's request for space had opened a door she had never planned to walk through, and with every mile between them, she felt the first small stirrings of something unexpected. Uncertainty, yes, but also the faint beginning of change. Boston greeted Emily Carter with cold wind and brick buildings that seemed older than her doubts, and from the moment she stepped out of South Station with one suitcase and a tight grip on her purse, she felt both small and strangely awake. She moved into her cousin Claire's compact apartment near the Charles River, where the radiator hissed at night and traffic hummed below, and though Claire tried to fill the rooms with warmth, late-night tea, and gentle jokes about fresh starts, Emily could not ignore the hollow space inside her chest that followed her from Seattle. Yet she refused to sink into it, so within days she updated her resume, printed copies at a corner shop, and walked through neighborhoods asking about work until she found Harbor Pages, a cozy bookstore tucked between a bakery and a tailor, its windows lined with novels and soft golden light. And when the owner, Mr. Whitman, a silver-haired man with kind eyes, asked if she had experience, she answered honestly that she loved books and needed a job, and somehow that was enough. The work was simple but steady, stacking new arrivals, organizing shelves by author, recommending titles to curious students from nearby colleges, and each small task gave her a sense of control she had not felt in months, and the rhythm of scanning barcodes and tying paper bags with twine kept her thoughts from drifting too far back to Daniel. Boston itself moved quickly, people walking with purpose, coffee in hand, voices sharp and alive, and Emily began to match that pace, waking early, catching the tea, learning shortcuts through narrow streets, telling herself that this city did not know her past and therefore did not judge it. On her second Thursday at Harbor Pages, a tall man with dark hair and a navy coat stepped inside just before closing, shaking rain from his shoulders and offering a polite smile as he headed straight for the historical fiction section, and Emily noticed the way he handled books carefully, reading back covers as if searching for something personal rather than casual entertainment. And when he approached the counter with a novel set in wartime France, he asked, "Do you think stories about the past help us understand our present?" And the question surprised her enough to make her forget her usual guarded tone, so she replied that sometimes stories show us courage we forget we have, and he studied her for a moment before introducing himself as Michael Bennett. Their first conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it lingered with her long after he left, and the following week he returned at nearly the same hour, this time asking for recommendations, and she suggested a book about rebuilding life after loss, without realizing how much she was speaking about herself. And Michael listened closely, not interrupting, not rushing, simply present, which felt rare and calming. Over the next several Thursdays, their exchanges grew longer, shifting from books to childhood memories, favorite cities, and the strange fear that comes with starting over in one's 30s, and Emily learned that Michael had once been engaged, that his wedding had been planned and canceled quietly when he and his fiancée realized they wanted different futures, and he spoke without bitterness, just with reflection, and Emily respected that honesty. Outside the bookstore, her life slowly expanded as well. She rented a small studio apartment with exposed brick walls and a single large window that overlooked a narrow street, and though the space was modest, it was hers alone. And she bought a secondhand desk, a blue throw blanket, and a plant she hoped would survive the winter, and each purchase felt like a small declaration of independence. Some nights she still cried, especially when memories of Seattle surfaced unexpectedly, a shared joke, a familiar song. But the tears did not last as long as before, because Boston demanded her attention, from crowded sidewalks to weekend markets, and Claire encouraged her to explore. So she began taking morning walks along the Charles River, watching rowers glide through calm water, breathing in crisp air that cleared her thoughts. Meanwhile, Michael's visits turned into invitations, first for coffee at a quiet cafe around the corner, where they sat by the window discussing novels and life choices, then for a Saturday afternoon walk through Boston Common, where fallen leaves crunched beneath their shoes, and he spoke about wanting a future built on partnership rather than pressure. And Emily listened carefully, aware of the gentle pull she felt, but cautious not to mistake comfort for destiny. One evening, heavy rain forced her to close the bookstore early, and Michael happened to arrive just as she was turning the sign to closed. And instead of leaving, he offered to walk her to the subway so she would not get soaked. And under the shared shelter of his umbrella, they laughed at the wind fighting against them, and for the first time since leaving Seattle, Emily felt light. Not because her problems were solved, but because she was no longer carrying them alone in silence. He never pushed her for details about her marriage, yet he sensed there was a story behind her careful pauses, and when he finally asked gently if she was waiting for someone back home, she admitted she was separated, unsure of what would happen next, and instead of stepping away, he simply nodded and said that uncertainty can sometimes be a gift, though it rarely feels like one at first. That sentence stayed with her as days passed, and she realized she was beginning to look forward to Thursdays, not just for conversation, but for the steady warmth of his presence, the way he valued her opinions, the way he asked about her dreams instead of her duties. Boston, once intimidating, started to feel like a place of possibility, and Emily noticed she laughed more freely with Claire, volunteered to host a small book club at the store, and even considered taking a writing class at a nearby community center, ideas she would have dismissed months earlier. Yet beneath this growth lingered a quiet question about Daniel, about whether space would lead them back together or further apart, and each time her phone buzzed, she felt a flicker of tension, though his messages remained brief and polite. Still, as autumn deepened and harbor pages filled with holiday shoppers, Emily sensed something shifting inside her, a strengthening spine, a clearer voice, and on a chilly evening when Michael lingered after closing, helping her stack chairs and turn off lights, he looked at her with an openness that made her heart beat faster and said, "You seem different from the first day I met you." And she smiled softly because she knew he was right. She was different, not because of him alone, but because she had stepped into a city that required her to stand on her own, and though she did not yet know what her future held, she understood that Boston was no longer just a temporary shelter. It was becoming the ground where she was rebuilding herself, one fast, brave step at a time. 3 months after arriving in Boston, Emily Carter felt the city moving through her like steady music, quick and alive, and the woman who once drove away from Seattle with shaking hands now walked through her neighborhood with quiet confidence, balancing coffee in one hand and keys in the other, greeting the bakery owner by name, laughing easily with Claire on weekend calls, and managing harbor pages with calm focus whenever Mr. Whitman stepped out. She no longer counted days since leaving Daniel, yet his absence remained like a soft echo in the background of her thoughts, not sharp enough to wound, but present enough to remind her of unfinished chapters. And it was on a gray Sunday afternoon, when she was sorting laundry in her small studio apartment with sunlight barely pushing through the clouds, that she heard a knock on the door and found a simple envelope waiting on the floor, her name written in handwriting she would recognize anywhere. Her heart tightened before she even opened it, and she stood still for a long moment, the room suddenly too quiet, before finally sliding her finger under the flap and unfolding the letter inside. Daniel's words were neat, careful, almost gentle, and as her eyes moved across the page, she felt time folding back on itself. He wrote that the house felt empty without her laughter, that the space he had asked for had shown him how much she had carried emotionally, how often she had tried to hold their world together while he drifted inward. He admitted that he had mistaken silence for peace and independence for strength, and he said he missed her not just as a wife but as his closest friend. He spoke of therapy sessions he had started attending, of long evenings spent thinking about their early years, of realizing that love requires presence and not just routine, and at the end he asked if she would consider coming home to try again, promising effort, honesty, and change. Emily read the letter twice, then a third time, each sentence pressing against memories she thought had settled, and tears filled her eyes, not from anger but from the weight of choice, because Daniel was not cruel or careless, he was flawed and human, and she had once loved him deeply. Perhaps she still did in some quiet corner of her heart. She sat on the edge of her bed, the letter resting in her lap, and imagined returning to Seattle, walking through the familiar doorway, hearing the same floorboards creak beneath her feet, sharing the same kitchen table where everything had shifted, and the thought brought both comfort and fear. Comfort in what was known, fear in whether she would shrink again to fit the shape of that life. That evening, she had plans with Michael, a small outdoor jazz concert near the river, and for a moment she considered canceling, needing space to think. But something inside her urged her to go, not to escape the decision but to face it clearly. So she dressed simply, folded Daniel's letter carefully into her purse, and stepped out into the cool air, the city lights reflecting off the water as she walked toward the music. Michael greeted her with a warm smile, spreading a blanket on the grass, and they sat close enough to share warmth as soft saxophone notes drifted through the crowd. Yet Emily's mind felt divided, half in Boston, half in Seattle, and when Michael asked if she was all right, she hesitated before telling him about the letter, choosing honesty over silence. He listened without interruption, his expression steady, and when she finished, he nodded slowly and said that second chances can be beautiful if both people truly grow, but staying out of fear can quietly dim a person's light, and his words were not pressure but perspective, offered gently. The music swelled, people around them clapped and laughed, and Emily felt the contrast between the lively present and the heavy past resting in her purse, and she realized this decision was not simply about choosing between two men, but about choosing the version of herself she wanted to protect. She thought about the months in Boston, about learning to navigate unfamiliar streets, about building friendships without leaning on anyone for identity, about discovering her voice in book recommendations and in quiet conversations by the river, and she recognized strength in herself that she had not noticed before. When Michael's hand brushed against hers on the blanket, neither of them pulled away, and the contact was simple yet meaningful, not rushed, not demanding, just steady. And in that moment she understood that what she felt for him was not built on rescue or rebellion, but on mutual respect and shared vulnerability. Later that night, back in her apartment, she unfolded Daniel's letter one more time and read it aloud softly, testing how the promises sounded in the quiet room, and she asked herself hard questions. Had she truly been unhappy or just comfortable? Had she communicated her needs clearly, or had she hidden behind routine? Could love survive distance and still grow? And most importantly, who was she becoming now? Sleep came slowly, and when morning arrived, she walked along the Charles River, watching rowers move in smooth rhythm, and she realized that forward motion requires trust in one's own balance. And though the past still mattered, it no longer defined her entirely. Days passed as she carried the letter folded in her bag, touching it absent-mindedly during work breaks, weighing options between ringing cash registers and stacked novels, and she noticed how her chest tightened at the thought of leaving Boston, of leaving the independence she had fought quietly to build, and how her heart felt lighter when imagining a future shaped by choice rather than expectation. Michael did not ask for updates, did not rush her decision, which only deepened her respect for him, and Claire reminded her gently over dinner that whatever she chose should reflect growth, not guilt. By the end of the week, Emily understood that clarity was forming, not in dramatic flashes, but in steady realization, and she booked a flight to Seattle, not as surrender, but as closure, knowing she needed to see Daniel face to face to understand her own heart fully. As the plane lifted into the sky, Boston shrinking beneath clouds, she held the armrest firmly, yet felt surprisingly calm, aware that she was no longer the woman who had left months earlier, and that whatever answer she gave would come from strength, not fear, because space had changed more than her marriage. It had changed her. And as the engines hummed and the horizon stretched wide ahead, Emily knew she was flying not just toward a conversation with her husband, but toward the final understanding of who she wanted to be. The plane touched down in Seattle under a blanket of gray clouds, and as Emily Carter stepped into the cool air, she felt a strange calm instead of the fear she once expected, because the woman returning now was not the same one who had left months ago with a trembling heart and unanswered questions. She drove past familiar streets lined with tall evergreens, past the coffee shop where she and Daniel used to spend lazy Sundays, past the park where they once talked about future plans, and each landmark stirred memory but did not pull her backward. And when she finally stood in front of the house that had once felt like the center of her world, she paused only a second before knocking, steady and sure. Daniel opened the door almost immediately, as if he had been waiting behind it, his expression filled with hope and nervous energy. And for a moment they simply looked at each other, taking in the small changes, his slightly tired eyes, her stronger posture, the quiet understanding that space had shaped them both. He stepped aside to let her in, and the house smelled the same, clean and warm, yet it no longer felt like a place that defined her, just a chapter she had lived inside. They sat across from each other in the living room, not at the kitchen table where the request had first been spoken, and Daniel began to talk, not rushed, not defensive, but open, telling her about counseling sessions that forced him to face his fear of failure, about realizing he had measured his worth only through work and forgot to nurture his marriage, about understanding that asking for space had been both honest and painful. He apologized for not sharing his confusion earlier, for letting silence grow between them, for assuming she would always remain steady while he sorted through his own doubts. And Emily listened carefully, noticing the sincerity in his tone, the humility in his words, and she respected the growth he described. When he finished, he looked at her with vulnerable hope and said he wanted to rebuild slowly, to date again, to create a partnership where both voices mattered equally, and the offer was thoughtful, not desperate. Yet Emily felt a gentle clarity rising within her. She told him about Boston, about harbor pages, and the way recommending books helped her rediscover confidence, about walking along the Charles River at sunrise and feeling peace in her own company, about realizing she had often placed her dreams quietly behind his ambitions without ever admitting it even to herself. And as she spoke, she saw Daniel truly hearing her, perhaps for the first time in years. She explained that the months apart had not filled her with anger, but with awareness, that she still cared for him deeply and valued the life they once shared. Yet she could not ignore how much she had grown by standing on her own. Daniel asked softly if there was someone else, and she answered honestly that there was someone who had shown her kindness and respect during a vulnerable time. But more important than that was the version of herself she had discovered, a woman capable of making choices without fear. Silence settled between them, heavy yet peaceful, and in that silence, Emily understood her answer completely. She reached for his hand, squeezed it gently, and told him that loving someone does not always mean staying. Sometimes it means honoring the truth of who both people have become, and she said she could not return to the old shape of their marriage because she had outgrown it. Daniel's eyes filled with tears, not of anger, but of acceptance, and he nodded slowly, admitting that part of him had sensed this outcome the moment he asked for space, because growth changes direction as much as it heals wounds. They stood and embraced, holding each other not as husband and wife trying to fix something, but as two people grateful for shared history, and in that embrace there was closure instead of conflict. Later that evening, Emily walked through the house one last time, touching the back of a chair, glancing at framed photographs, feeling appreciation rather than regret. And when she stepped outside with her suitcase, Daniel carried it to her car just as he had months earlier, only this time the goodbye felt lighter, grounded in mutual respect. As she drove away, she did not check the mirror repeatedly. She kept her eyes forward, understanding that endings can be gentle and still powerful. Back in Boston days later, the city greeted her with brisk wind and familiar energy, and she walked straight to the river before even going home, standing by the water as rowers cut clean lines across the surface, breathing deeply as if claiming the air as her own. She called Daniel that evening to thank him for listening and to wish him well, and the conversation was calm, a final thread tied neatly rather than torn. When she met Michael again at Harbor Pages after closing, she did not rush into his arms or speak dramatic words. Instead, she looked at him with steady eyes and told him she had chosen her new life, chosen growth, chosen to remain where she felt whole, and his response was not triumph but quiet support, because he understood that her decision was about independence first and romance second. They walked along the Charles River as the sun set behind the skyline, their hands brushing before finally holding firmly, and Emily felt no guilt, only gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. She knew love with Michael would unfold slowly, built on conversation, respect, and shared dreams, not on fear of loneliness, and she welcomed that pace. Weeks turned into months, and Emily continued working at the bookstore, started a small writing group on Thursday evenings, and explored corners of Boston she once overlooked, and each step felt intentional. Sometimes she thought of Seattle with warmth, remembering the good years without bitterness, understanding that Daniel's request for space had not been a betrayal but a turning point, a doorway that forced her to see herself clearly. She realized that life does not always break loudly when it changes. Sometimes it shifts with a simple sentence spoken at a kitchen table on a rainy night. And the courage lies in walking through the open door rather than clinging to the familiar room. Standing by the river one evening, city lights reflecting like scattered stars on the water, Emily felt certain that she had not lost a marriage but gained her voice, and as Michael wrapped an arm gently around her shoulders, she understood that the greatest love she found was not just in another person's presence, but in her own steady heart. Finally confident enough to choose the future without fear.